بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا أما بعد. Beginning by the permission of Allah Azza wa Jal, reading from the book Al-Jaami li-Akhlaaq ar-Raawi wa adab-as-Saami'. Al-Jaami li-Akhlaaq ar-Raawi wa adab-as-Saami'. The book which is called the Comprehensive Compendium for the narrator of Hadith, for the student of Hadith, for the disciple of Hadith, for the adherent of Hadith. A comprehensive collection compendium with chains of narrations, with chapter headings, specifically and exclusively geared for Hadith disciple. طيب. This book is by Al-Hafiz Al-Khatib Al-Baghdadi rahimahullah, who we all know died in the year 463 of the Hijrah. And right here, right now, we will not be mentioning his biography in detail. Al-Khatib Al-Baghdadi rahimahullah ta'ala is famous and well known throughout the world, especially in the ranks and in the societies of the Hadith culture. His life, his legacy, his works, his impact on Islam and its sciences, especially Hadith, is something which will require at least one full lecture, if not a set of lectures, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And it's something that is not only worthy of mentioning, worth mention, but it's very extremely important, especially when we talk about the Hadith Renaissance and reviving and resurrecting and bringing back the culture of Hadith, and also reforming certain things and doing away with certain misconceptions, certain prejudices, certain inaccuracies, certain fallacies pertaining to the culture of Hadith and what it is and what it is not, the scholars, the students, the books, authenticity, compilation, and the list goes on of things in which there's a great need for tasfiyah and tarbiyah, tasfiyah and tarbiyah, to purge, to get rid of, to rid out, as I said, misconceptions, inaccuracies, absurdities, prejudices, things that are not valid, that are not accurate with regards to Hadith science and Hadith culture, whether it be Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Muwatta Malik, Musnad Ahmed, the companions, the narrators, the different sciences of naqd, criticism, jarh ta'dil, ilm al-rijal. Many people who give praise and acclaim to Hadith sciences by saying they criticize the narrators, they critiqued the narrators, they made a scrupulous, meticulous attack on the weak narrators and the chains of reports, so on and so forth. And that's only partially true. There's much more to Hadith science than criticizing the sanad, but the criticism of the matan. So the point is that when we talk about the Hadith Renaissance, which includes reviving, bringing it back, re-uploading it, the old uploads, re-uploading them, blowing the dust off the things that are there, polishing the wood with the pledge and the oil, resurrecting it, restoring it, bringing it quote-unquote back to life, whereas much of it has been forgotten and abandoned and neglected, and a great amount of dust has piled on these crates, quote-unquote. And also not just reviving and restoring, but also getting rid of and throwing out the different inaccuracies and misconceptions with regards to the sciences of Hadith. So this book, and Al-Khatib Al-Baghdadi rahimahullah and many other great scholars, it's very important for us to mention this and explain this and talk about this when we speak about the Hadith Renaissance. Khairan inshallah. Ibn Rajab rahimahullah, we know, who died in the 8th century, 795 to be exact. He, like all other scholars of Hadith after Khatib al-Baghdadi, benefited from him tremendously. And he spoke about Khatib al-Baghdadi, his ups and his downs, his pros and his cons. And he mentioned, and obviously he's over about a little less than 300 years after Khatib's death. He mentions that he says, وَأَنَّ بِسَاطَهُ قَدْ طُوِيَ مُنْذُ أَزْمَانٍ, is that the carpet of Hadith has been rolled up years ago. years ago. In the 8th century, Ibn Rajab said, and this was before Ibn Hajar, this was before Sheikh Al-Albani, this was before this alim and that alim of hadith. They said that the sciences of hadith, their carpets have been rolled up years ago, generations ago. The true hadith masters are gone. And he's in the 8th century. So imagine in 2020, when we talk about liberal and progressive and Islam 2.0 and LGBTQ, and we talk about taqleed, blind followers and fanatics, people who claim hadith who haven't studied, haven't been overseas, haven't memorized anything, haven't done any service to ilm al-hadith. The only thing they know about ilm al-hadith is sahih al-Albani, da'af al-Albani. Albani made it authentic, Albani made it weak. That's all they know about ilm al-hadith, is nukhbat al-fikr and taqrib al-tahdhib. That's it, nothing else. So he said that in his century. Imagine what he would say now if he saw the people. And also al-Dhahabi rahimahullah, he quoted يعني in سير أعلام النبلاء about يعني أين أهل الحديث يعني لا أكاد أراهم إلا في كتاب أو تحت تراب أو بهذا المعنى. It says, where are the people of hadith? I can barely see them, I can barely find them. Only time I find someone from hadith is if it's in a book or in the dirt. They're dead, they're gone. And Hafiz Dhahabi rahimahullah also died in the 8th century. So the concept of people of hadith being the minority, people being dedicated, adherents to the culture and to the science, to its memorization, to spreading it, to pumping it, to propagating it, to upholding it, trying their best to live by it, to govern their lives thereby, is a difficulty. It's not something that you're going to find to be that common, to be that easy. And not only is this the case with Islam, with other people besides Muslims as well. People who like the old ways and the traditional ways, the ancient ways, the real, true, authentic stuff is hard to find. But alhamdulillah, those who admire antiquity and admire handmade things, handmade goods, craftsmanship, the real stuff, they're still out there, walillahil hamd, no matter how few, no matter how much of a minority they may be, but they're still out there, they still do exist. And there are specialty stores for people like this. And this is one of the most important guiding principles of Hadith Disciple. Our channel and our movement, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, is to bring back the old good stuff and to preserve it and to restore it and to simplify it and to explain it and to propagate it and to push it. So these are some of the reasons why we've chosen this book. And alhamdulillah, this, I can't say 100%, but a large part of this path that we have undertook or trod upon, without a question, has been uncharted. Alhamdulillah, this holy path, inshallah, this holy conquest of explaining the books of adab, talab al-ilm in general, of the books of the past, simplifying them, and also mentioning the books with the different asanid, the chains of narration. Much of this path is totally uncharted. Much of it. Okay? And I'll take pride in this. Walillahil hamd. I'm boasting about Allah's favor upon me. Walillahil hamd. And inshallah ta'ala, this book will be the next in the series of which we have done, the different books in which we have explained and commented on the channel. Maybe about a year ago, maybe more than that, I was in Toronto, and we explained mawadi', bits and parts, sections of the mukhtasar of this book of Sheikh Bakr Abu Zayd rahimahullah. He came along, he made a tahdhib, he made an ikhtisar of Khatib al-Baghdadi's book, and we read parts of it. But now we're going to actually undertake the asl, inshaAllah ta'ala. And all of this, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, we hope from Allah is that we will be included in the Prophet ﷺ's words about the لا تزال طائفة من أمتي منصورين, okay, أو ظاهرين. People will always be victorious. At least one group from my nation, they will remain steadfast, they will be upright, no matter who betrays them, who forsakes them, no matter what happens, they will always remain steadfast. And we know that many of the ulama of hadith, Ali ibn al-Madini, Bukhari, Ahmed, and others, they would say, يعني إن لم يكونوا أهل الحديث فلا أدري من هم. I don't know who they are if they're not the people of hadith. If the saved sect isn't the people of hadith, I don't know who they can be. Alright, khairan inshaAllah. So with that being said, Khatib al-Baghdadi's biography, inshaAllah ta'ala, we'll mention it in a separate lecture by Allah's permission. And what's important is is that this book is very similar to the last book that we did, Kitab al-Ilm of Al-Hafidh Abu Khaytham Zuhair ibn Harb of the 3rd century. It is musnad. All of the chains of narrations are there for all the athar, the mawqufat, and the marfu'at. And there is commentary, much more commentary than Zuhair ibn Harb's book. Khatib al-Baghdadi rahimahullah was from a different century, the 5th century, not the 3rd century. And Islamic scholarship and the styles of writing books were different, let alone the purity and the orthodoxy of Zuhair ibn Harb in his way than the Khatib. Khatib lived in a different era, the 5th century. Different things happened, different people came. There were different ideologies, philosophies were out there. Khatib also, in some of these things, was affected, which we'll get into in his biography. Zuhair ibn Harb's book is pure and orthodox. Hadith. No kalam, no speech, just boom. Haddathana, akhbarana, haddathana, akhbarana. Right? Not saying that it's bad and it's haram to make commentary and to add your speech. And many ulama of the 3rd century did, such as Muslim in his Muqaddimah, such as Tirmidhi in his Ilal al-Saghir. Alright? Abu Dawud rahimahullah, his letter to the people of Mecca, right? Tirmidhi in his Jami', right? Okay, Bukhari rahimahullah on some of the Abwab, right? So no one take that to the extreme. But many great ulama of hadith, they wouldn't put any kalam in their hadith books, such as Imam Ahmed. And they believed that it was just al-hadith al-sart, sirf, just pure hadith, nothing else. There is no rice and salad and this, it's just meat, freshly cooked meat, charred meat, smoked meat. Well, that's all you need on a plate, nothing else. Juicy meat, bismillah, that's it. That was the way of Imam Ahmad and many great scholars. They will put in their books just the kalam of the Prophet, and that was it, after the isnad, right? And even Imam Muslim rahimahullah ta'ala, in his Sahih, after the Muqaddimah, his speech is very, very, very little. Every now and then he'll say, وفي حديث فلان كذا زاد فلان كذا وفي حديث فلان حرف تركناه, so on, and that's it. Bukhari's book is different. Bukhari's book is much more of a hybrid book. It's much more than just hadith. There's a lot of fiqh in it as well, and other things, other commentary as well. طيب. So Khatib al-Baghdadi's book, that's what the book is about, and that's how he wrote the book. It's a very large book. The edited version here is of 2 volumes. Dr. Muhammad Ajaj, okay, Al-Khatib, he did the tahqiq and the dirasa and the study of the book. So it's about 2 volumes. In Arabic, obviously, it's much smaller without the tahqiq, the original manuscript, right? طيب. So Khatib al-Baghdadi rahimahullah, he himself is going to explain why he wrote the book, inshallah, and you'll see that in a second. طيب. So Al-Khatib, he says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillahi ذي القدرة والجلال والنعم السابقة والأفضال الذي من علينا بمعرفته وهدانا إلى الإقرار بربوبيته وجعلنا من أمة خاتم النبيين السامي بفضل على سائر العالمين الطاهر الأعراق الشريف الأخلاق. قال الله الكريم مخاطبا له في ذكر الحكيم وإنك لعلى خلق عظيم صلى الله عليه وأزلف منزلته لديه وعلى إخوانه وأقربيه وصحابته الأخيار وتابعيه وسلم عليه وعليهم أجمعين دائما أبدا إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد، فقد ذكرت في كتاب شرف أصحاب الحديث ما يحدو ذا الهمة على تتبع آثار رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم والاجتهاد في طلبها والحرص على سماعها والاهتمام بجمعها والانتساب إليها. ولكل علم طريقة ينبغي لأهله أن يسلكوها وآلات يجب عليهم أن يأخذوا بها ويستعملونها. وقد رأيت خلقا من أهل هذا الزمان ينتسبون إلى الحديث ويعدون أنفسهم من أهله المتخصصين بسماعه ونقله، وهم أبعد الناس مما يدعون وأقلهم معرفة بما إليه ينتسبون. يرى الواحد منهم إذا كتب عددا قليلا من الأجزاء واشتغل بالسماع برهة يسيرة من الدهر أنه صاحب حديث على الإطلاق، ولما يجهد نفسه ويتعبها في طلابه ولا لحقته مشقة الحفظ لصنوف وأبوابه كما أخبرنا إلى آخره. طيب. So Al-Khatib rahimahullah, of course, he starts his book by praising Allah, declaring Allah's blessings, Allah's oneness, thanking him lauding Allah Azza wa Jal for making us Muslims from the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he talks about some of the virtues of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his background, his lineage, his character, most importantly, right? And sending prayers and salutations upon his companions and his followers. Then he goes on and he speaks about a previous work of his, which is the book Sharafu Ashab al-Hadith, the nobility of the Hadith disciples. And he mentions that in that book, he says, I have given you the proofs and evidences for the superiority, for the virtue of seeking the Hadith, of being a disciple of Hadith, why it is such an excellent thing. And he says, and in that book, I've given all the necessary encouragement. Those who have high aspirations to seek the sciences of Hadith and to learn it, to listen, to memorize, etc., right? And then he says, every science, every field, every discipline has rules. There are parameters. There is a way, there's a manner, there's an etiquette that the adherents of that science and that discipline must follow. They must abide by, they must stick to, right? A behavior, a code of behavior, right? A code of honor, right? That they have to stick to. Now, and he says here, there are many people that I've seen, people of my era, who claim to be upon the way of Hadith. They call themselves students of Hadith, and they claim that they are specialists of Hadith, and they're the furthest people from that which they claim. What they say and what they talk about is totally different than what they're actually doing. And they have the least amount of knowledge of what they're boasting and bragging about. He says, rahimahullah ta'ala, Khatib, after that, and these people here, people of my time and of my era, one of them just writes hadiths for a short period of time, a couple books that he wrote down, and he considers himself to be an absolute hadith master. And this person has not exhausted himself. He's not tired himself. He has not felt the pain, the bone-creaking pain of hifd, of memorizing, right? And writing and putting it together. And then he goes on to quote an athar. So we see now why he wrote the book, which is clear. He saw people claiming hadiths, but they weren't behaving properly. They didn't have the right do's and don'ts, didn't have the necessary parameters. And they were sticking out their chests and putting up their heads and claiming something that they were far from. 463, guys. Just imagine in 2020. Allahu musta'an. Started with myself. What we claim, what we attach ourselves to, what we do, how we perform, different story. What we devote ourselves to, different story. And if you look at the different phenomenal things today in the world and dawah, look how many people claim to be students of knowledge. And not only have they not worked hard and memorized and studied and broken their backs studying, they haven't even went overseas. They didn't even go anywhere. They're self-taught, self-educated. And they have the nerve and the audacity and the total, absolute lack of shame to talk about people that were overseas for years out of their lives, sacrificed so much, gave up so much, went through so much, and they didn't even leave the United States. They didn't even leave Birmingham. They didn't even leave London. They didn't even leave their hometown. They didn't study anywhere for a long period of time, if any period of time. And they have that much lack of shame to open up their foul, filthy mouths and talk about people that have sacrificed for years and years and years. Very phenomenal, very paradoxical. And the only thing you can say is, La ilaha illallah, yani hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakil. Subhanallah. A person you would think would have some shame, right? All right, this guy, I don't like him. This guy, I envy him. Or maybe I don't envy him, but I don't like him. He's a deviant. He said this, but, he was overseas and I was just here all this time, living comfortably. Let me keep my mouth shut. Let me be quiet. I'll let someone else talk about him. Let someone else refute him. Let someone else speak ill of him, but not me, because I didn't go anywhere. This guy was in Mecca, Medina, Yemen, Egypt, studying all of those years. He was in Pakistan. He was in Mali and Senegal, Morocco, studying for all of those years. with scorpions, no food to drink, to eat, bad water to drink, being cold in the winter, hot in the summer. His family complaining about him. Comes back to America, he gets harassed in the airport, harassed by the border patrol or security, the FBI, the people are on him. And I have a comfortable, easy life. Let me keep my mouth shut. Let me not say anything about him. Not because I'm wrong and he's right, but just the sheer fact that shame. What discipline would this work in? If we were talking about martial arts, and we were talking about Aikido, and there were people who learned Aikido in New York City, okay? Or they practiced, for example, judo. Or they practiced, for example, the different types of fencing, Japanese swordsmanship, right? Okay, kendo, right? And they learned in New York. Or in California, Los Angeles somewhere. No problem. My teacher, my sensei was from Japan, or is an American who studied in Japan, or whatever the case may be. Tell you, would he speak ill? Would he speak negatively? Would he make a campaign against someone who left New York City, who left Los Angeles, and went to Japan for 5 years? 5 years, that's only half a decade. Do you know among the non-Muslims how well respected people are when they talk about not Islam, but Islam? They say, I lived in the Middle East for 6 months. I actually went to Iran and went to the Shiite libraries. I went to Egypt. I studied in Azhar for a week. I went to Kuwait, such and such, for a week. And the non-Muslims say, wow, you actually there? You took an Arabic course in Egypt for a year? And to us, the Muslims, in our culture, that's nothing. 5, 10, 15, 20 years, that's nothing. A year, 6 months, 3 months. But just imagine the person who went to Japan for a year straight, gave up his family. He lived with the sensei, the senpai. He lived with him. He took off his shoes. He sat at the wooden table. He ate with the chopsticks with the master's family. His wife served him. His little kids, he played with them. He taught them English. And he was there studying for 5 years. And he came back. Do you think that the guy who just learned how to use a wooden sword in New York City would open up his mouth and say anything about him? Of course he wouldn't. And one of the reasons why he wouldn't is because of shame and pure respect for the art. And having someone that has never went to Japan, where Kendo and Aikido came from, that person can never be compared to someone who's living in Manhattan and walks outside and eats at a sidewalk cafe, or goes to a hot dog cart or a food cart and then goes back into the dojo. It's not the same as the person who lives in Japan, who's being discriminated against because he's not Japanese, because he can't speak good Japanese. The person who's sick and in the hospital from food poisoning. The person who has a hard time adjusting to the Japanese lifestyle. It's of no comparison to the one that's in the mountains with the snow. He's cold, and the master makes him sleep in a cabin without no heat. And he doesn't pick up a wooden sword for a year. Cut down trees, burn the trees, make the charcoal, prepare the things for the furnace for me to make the sword. And that's it. Sweep the steps, mop the dojo. That's your job. Cook the rice and the fish, nothing else. He had to be humiliated. He had to go through so much just for the sensei to accept him. Now, we talk about martial arts, and we always make comparison to martial arts and Dawah and Hadith disciple, as those who watch know. I know several people who have been overseas and actually studied in China, studied in Japan, and studied in other parts of the world with different types of martial arts. And in the United States, for those who are from the United States, you can read about a man whose name was Robert Duncan. Robert Duncan was a black American who was alive, and perhaps he reached his peak of popularity in the 70s and the 80s. He was someone who studied different types of ninjutsu and different things like this. So he became popular, he became famous one way or another. And years after he had retired, and he had 2 or 3 different generations of students that he raised and taught in his arts, he did interviews. People wanted to know his life, his legacy, his journey. And they interviewed him. They asked him a question once. And they said, is there racism in martial arts? Or is the martial arts world free from racism? He says, of course there's racism. Of course there is. And they asked him, when you were in Japan, did anyone treat you or discriminate against you or use prejudice or treat you differently because of racism? He says, of course. He says, first and foremost, I'm not Japanese. Not even a black and white thing, but I'm just not Japanese. I'm not Japanese. Let alone I'm black and how certain people would look at black people there. He said I had to fight and elbow my way in and prove that I was strong, that I was dedicated, that I was devoted. And I forced the master to look at me and accept me as a pupil and to see my potential. And if that wasn't the case, he wouldn't have accepted me just because I wasn't Japanese. So do you think there's someone who learned some things in New York City is going to open up his mouth about Ronald Duncan? You think he's going to talk about him, badmouth him? Khatib rahimahullah says, وَلَا لَحِقَتْهُ مَشَقَّةُ الْحِفْدِ. The mashaqqa, the hardship of memorization hasn't touched him. He doesn't know what it's like to be hungry in Medina. He doesn't know what it's like to be hungry, have no food in Yemen, starving. He doesn't know he can't even imagine that. And he opens up his filthy mouth to talk about someone like that. That's shameful. And the person does that lacks shame. And the Prophet ﷺ says, إِذَا لَمْ تَسْتَحِي فَاصْنَعْ مَا شِئْتَ. Do whatever you want to do if you have no shame. If you don't mind dishonoring yourself, tafaddal, open up your mouth and talk about the brother who was overseas for years and you were a kafir at the time. You weren't even a Muslim yet. Or you were in jail at the time. Or you were learning alif, ba, ta, and he was sitting at the feet of the ulama. If you have no shame, then go ahead and do that and go ahead and say that. Now, in real life, there was a brother that I knew. He was a Muslim. Brother was from Connecticut. I won't mention his name. He studied overseas. He studied in Japan. And he also mentioned similar stories with regards to prejudice and racism and just the harshness of the teacher. And he said that when I got there were certain things that I didn't do, I didn't accept. I just, being American. He says, and the sensei would beat me. He had a bamboo stick and he would crack it over my back and hit me. And then he said as time went on, the master used several different bamboo things and he broke all of them on his back. And as time went on, the brother, he's also black American, black Muslim, he told the sensei, says, listen, sensei, he says, you can beat as many sticks as you want on me, but you'll find me to be a good student. You'll find me to be a humble student. Beat me if you like, but I'll be one of your best students. So just think about that versus the person who's living and paying money monthly at some studio storefront dojo in downtown Brooklyn or downtown New York. No comparison. So Khatib rahimahullah ta'ala, the point that we're trying to get to is that he's trying to show you that these people are claiming things and they're far from it. And one of the reasons why we have so much confusion in da'wah, so much fawda, so things are so chaotic and in such disarray, people are all over the place, people are confused, they don't know who to listen to or learn from, is because there are people with microphones, people in front of cameras that have no business in front of cameras and microphones. They have not studied, they have not learnt, they have not touched, or the pains of studying haven't touched them. That's for any talib al-ilm, let alone the elite. The elite, the special forces from among the tulab al-ilm are supposed to be the students of hadith. This person isn't even a student of knowledge, let alone a student of hadith, and he has the nerve to talk about people who actually are tulab of ilm and tulab al-hadith. That's very sad and it's very unfortunate, but it is our fault for allowing these people in and giving these people notoriety and popularity. Tight. There's a very long study or story and discussion of racism and prejudice in the martial arts world. Obviously, it's not the proper time to talk about this, but this is very relevant, and it's very, we can relate to it. It's very relevant to the discussion of hadith and ilm and dawah. There's no doubt about that. And one of the reasons why is because of the different prejudices that were shown against Asian Americans, different immigrants who came to the United States before and after World War II from China and from Japan, and how they were treated, let alone the Chinese that were in the United States for a very long time. They built the different railroads, right, in the West, California, San Francisco, worked in many of the different gold and silver mines, and they went through a lot of prejudice and discrimination. And one of the things that they held pride in was their martial arts. And they had a code in which they were not allowed to teach a foreigner, a round eye. I mean, they weren't allowed to teach an American for several reasons. And an interesting fact, one of the reasons why World War II was started and initiated with between Imperial Japan and America, according to the Japanese, was the fact of how they treated Japanese immigrants, what they did to them how they froze many of Japan's assets, their banking assets, their money, all different dirty, underhanded slight that they did. And many historians hold the view that Japan was forced to initiate Pearl Harbor. We're not here to talk about the history of World War II, but I'm just trying to show you how history works. And it's easy to hear from one side of the combatants why the war was started. Japan was evil. They were evil. They were evil. They were evil. Maybe they were evil, but that's easy for you to say. So the point is that these prejudices and these extremes, they lead to other prejudices and other extremes. That's the point. And obviously, one of the most famous martial artists was Bruce Lee of the modern era. And when he came to the United States, he ran into a great deal of problems with many Chinese Americans because he refused to obey that law. And that law was never, ever teach anyone other than the Chinese martial arts. And he refused. And he didn't obey. And he told them that martial arts is for everyone. It knows no race. It knows no bloodline. It knows no color or sex or gender or class. It's for anyone. And obviously, one of the first disciples of Bruce Lee in the United States, and one of his best, one of his earliest, was a black American. One of the few people to believe in him when many people were mistreating him. And Allah knows best. Moving forward, Khatib, rahimahullah ta'ala, after he speaks on this phenomenon of these different people claiming to be from Tulab al-Ilm, from Tulab al-Hadith, and not actually being so, he quotes his first sanad. He says, كما أخبرنا أبو حازم عمر بن أحمد بن إبراهيم العبدوية أو العبدوي الحافظ إملاء بن نيسابور قال أخبرنا أبو محمد عبد الله بن محمد بن زياد قال أخبرنا محمد بن إسحاق الثقفي قال حدثنا محمد بن سهل بن عسكر قال حضرت المأمون بالمصيصية فقام إليه رجل بيده محبرة فقال يا أمير المؤمنين صاحب حديث منقطع به قال فوقف المأمون فقال له إيش تحفظ في باب كذا وكذا قال فسكت الرجل فقال المأمون حدثنا ابن علية عن فلان عن فلان فلان وحدثنا حجاج العور عن ابن جرير كذا حتى عد فيه كذا حديثا ثم قال إيش تحفظ في باب كذا قال فسكت فسرد فيه كذا حديثا ثم قال أحدهم يطلب الحديث 3 أيام يقول أنا صاحب حديث أعطوه 3 دراهم. Khatib, he mentions his sanad, his isnad, from Abu Hazim, Umar ibn Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Abdawi, the great Hafiz, and he reported in Nishapur, in dictation mode, from Abu Muhammad, Abdullah Muhammad ibn Ziyad, from Muhammad ibn Ishaq al-Thaqafi, from Muhammad ibn Sahal ibn Askar, who said, Muhammad ibn Sahal ibn Askar, he said, that I witnessed the Khalifa Ma'mun, obviously the Abbasid dynasty. He was the leader, and a man who was holding an inkwell, an ink pot. He stood up and he walked up to the leader, the caliph, and he said, "O commander of the faithful, I'm a student of hadith, I'm the hadith disciple, and I have no money. I'm poor, I'm a wayfarer, I'm far from my land, my hometown. Could you, please help me out?" So the caliph, he stood and he asked him, "Tell me what you've memorized concerning this." The man kept silent. So the caliph himself, Ma'mun, he quoted chains of narration. Fulan, hadathana, akhbarana, ta, 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 ta. Then he asked him again, "What have you memorized about such and such and such and such?" The man kept silent. And the caliph, Ma'mun, he said, "Hadathana, akhbarana, ta, 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 hadith, 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 hadith." And then the caliph, he said, one of these people, they seek hadith for 3 days, and then they say, "I'm a hadith disciple." He says, to throw him 3 coins. In other words, get out my face. We would say in America, get lost, scram, give this stray dog some scraps and get out of my face. Basically, أعطوه 3 دراهم. Throw him some change and take him out of my presence immediately. He was disgusted in him. So this first athar, that's the first athar of the book, athar number 1, and it goes to show that from a very long time, there have been people who quoted and claimed to be people of hadith, and they barely memorized anything, they barely studied anything, they barely had anything under their belts. And what do the Arabs say? ما أشبه الليلة بالبارحة. Right? Okay. ما أشبه الليل بالبارحة, they say, right? How reminiscent is yesterday or today of yesterday? yani, subhanallah, look how close it is. In other words, think about then and think about now. People who claim to be students of knowledge, claim to be students of hadith, and they have nothing under their belts, nothing that they've accomplished that's tangible. And the only thing they do is can quack and bark. Quack, bark, and howl. Scream, holler, talk, insult, gossip, quote this scholar, scholar Fulan said, scholar Fulan said. And many times, and we say this all the time when we end our session with this, many people, they talk about scholars, but they really don't have respect for scholars. And oftentimes, these people are weak and incapable, and they just hide behind scholars. They're really not people of ilm. And the easiest and unfortunately the cheapest way to mask your ignorance is just say a scholar, a scholar, a scholar, a scholar, a scholar. And then when someone doesn't say scholar, 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 and tries to learn and study and try to attempt to learn things and to research things independently, they have to attack that person and degrade that person because that person is going to expose them, right? Unfortunately, when the serious students come, the fake students, they'll become nervous. And the only way to get rid of that nervousness is to insult them and to slander them and to attack their character. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala surely knows best. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.